All right, class. We're on day 2, Bunnicula, rabbit tail of mystery. Look at his fangs there. Well, so far we found out that they found this rabbit at the movies, and they got it home, and the two boys are constantly fighting over it. Okay? And so we got Toby and we got Pete. They're arguing over who gets to keep the rabbit in their room, etc., etc. The dad's sitting on the couch in his raincoat, still soaking wet. Harold and Chester are checking things out. And remember, Chester's the cat that can not only think about himself, he's thinking about, if the rabbit doesn't drink the milk, I want it. All right. Mom, Toby says he's going to keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room. Only sometimes, I thought, when I know he's got leftover ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt that he shares his stash with me. It was, after all, at one of these late-night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake. And Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing. And the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned me by my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crink in my neck all day. But he's mine, Toby said. I found him. You sat on him, you mean. I found him, and he's sleeping in my room. You can't keep smelly old Harold, and you can keep smelly old Harold in yours, and Chester too if you want to. But I'm going to keep the rabbit in mine. Smelly old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly indeed. Page 12 if you have your books and are following along. Mr. Moreau spoke up. I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room, on the table by the window. It's light there, and he'll get lots of fresh air. Pete's taller than I am, Toby cried. He'll be able to see the rabbit better. Too bad, squirt. Okay, said Mr. Moreau through clenched teeth. Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep. Why? Pete asked. I don't want to go to sleep. Mrs. Moreau smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. Look, Ma, said Toby, he's not drinking his milk. Chester nudged me in the ribs. Now remember, me is the dog. Chester, the cat, nudged me in the ribs. Didn't I tell you, he said. Excuse me while I make myself available. Hey, said Toby, we gotta name him. Can't that wait until tomorrow? Asked Mr. Moreau. The boys shouted in unison. No! That means both of them shouted together. He has to have a name right now. I have to say I agree with them. It looks like 3 days. It took 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were going to call me Fluffy, as Miss Moreau had suggested. Well, all right, sighed Mrs. Moreau. What about, say, Bun Bun? Oh, my goodness, this mom is crazy. Let's call the bunny Bun Bun. Bunny? Get it? Oh, there she goes again, I thought. Where does she get them? Yuck, we all said. Well, then, how about Fluffy? She offered hopefully. Pete looked at his mother and smiled. You never give up, do you, Ma? Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Moreau's ankles and purring loudly. Now, what do you think the cat wants, if you could predict? Probably wants the rabbit's milk, right? No, Chester, not now, she said, pushing him aside. He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester? Toby asked as he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. Come on, Harold, Toby called. You got to help with the name, too. I joined the family, and serious thinking began. We all peered into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. So this is a rabbit, I thought. He sort of looks like Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail, and a motor in his nose. Now, if you've ever seen a rabbit or a bunny, their nose is always twitch, 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 twitch. It's always moving. And so that's what he meant by it's a motor in his nose. Well, said Pete after a moment, since we found him at the movies, why don't we call him Mr. Johnson? There was a moment of silence. Who's Mr. Johnson? Asked Toby. Well, he's the guy who owns the movie theater, Pete answered. No one seemed to like that idea. "How about Prince?" said Miss Monroe. "Dad," said Toby, "are you kidding me?" "Well, I had a dog named Prince once," he replied lamely. Prince, I thought. That's a silly name for a dog. "We found him at a Dracula movie." "Let's call him Dracula, ha ha ha," Toby said. "That's a stupid name," said Pete. "No, it's not. Anyways, I found him, so I should get to name him." Excuse me. "Mom, you're not going to let him name him, are you? That's favoritism. I'll be traumatized if you do." Miss Monroe looked in wonder at Pete. "Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula, ha 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 ha," cried Toby. "Please, please, please." And with each please, he squeezed Chester a little harder. Mrs. Monroe picked up the bowl of milk and moved it towards the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. Can you picture it? The boy is squeezing him tighter. "Please, please, please." And he squeezed him so tight that his eyes are almost popping out. And he wants that milk, and the milk's going back to the kitchen now. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, "Let's not have any more arguments. We'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him in a Dracula movie. So we'll call him Bunnicula. 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 That should make everyone happy, including me." "What about me?" muttered Chester. "I won't be happy until she puts down that milk." "Well, guys, is that okay with you?" she asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another, and then the rabbit, and a smile grew on Toby's face. "Yeah, Ma, I think that's just right." Peter shrugged. "It's okay, but I get to feed him." "Okay, I'm going to put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he'll drink it tomorrow." "What about Chester?" Toby said, dropping the frantic cat to the floor. "Maybe he would like it." Chester made a beeline. That means he ran a straight line for Mrs. Monroe and looked up at her plaintively, meaning, "Please, please, please let me have that milk." "Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester boy? You already had your milk today." She reached down and patted Chester on the head and then walked in the kitchen. Chester didn't move. "Okay, bedtime," said Miss Monroe. "Good night, Bunnicula," Toby said. "Good night, Count Bunnicula," Pete said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvania accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. "Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester." I licked Toby good night. "Good night, smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester." I drooled on Pete's feet. "Mom, Harold drooled on my foot. Good night, Pete," Mrs. Monroe said with great finality as she came back into the living room, and then, more calmly, "Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester." Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went up the stairs together. "You know, dear," Mr. Monroe said, "that was very clever. Bunnicula, ha ha ha. I could never have thought of the name like that. Oh, you don't know, Robert." She smiled as she put her arms through his. "I think Prince is a lovely name, too." The room was quiet. Chester was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly he turned to me. "I wish they had named him Fluffy," was all he said. And that's where we'll stop today.